Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 551. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about the Big Five, a big waterfall, a big honeymoon, and a fish with really big teeth as we go to Zambia.
I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Without further ado, let's talk about Zambia. I'd like to welcome to the show Graham Wales, coming to us from outboundclan.com, and come to talk to us about Zambia. Graham, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you pitched me Zambia, which is a place we have talked about very, very little on Amateur Traveler. We have talked about going to the falls there, but we really haven't talked about the rest of the country. So there is much to cover. But why should we talk about Zambia? Why should someone travel to Zambia?
Zambia is, I think it's a really off the beaten path sort of destination. And I should preface this by saying my wife and I took a honeymoon through Africa. We did a self-drive tour through 15 countries. And so we saw a lot in southern Africa, and then we went up through Zambia, and then into Eastern Africa. We saw a lot, and we didn't have a whole lot of expectations for Zambia, to be honest, but we were really big fans of the country by the time that we left. It seemed like such an unassuming place, and it's so off the beaten path. Beyond Victoria Falls, people don't really consider much about Zambia at all. They don't really think that there's that much going on, but there really is a lot, especially for nature lovers like us. So I guess that's why I wanted to talk about Zambia.
That sounds a little bit like an epic honeymoon there. How long was the honeymoon?
It was fantastic. It was almost 7 months.
Oh, wow.
I wrote a book about it. It's called Fortune, Folly, and 1,000 Fates. And the subtitle is A Disastrously Impulsive Honeymoon in Africa, which is perfectly descriptive of what we went through. It was really an insane trip. We bought a car in Cape Town and drove it all the way up to Nairobi and then back to Cape Town.
That
We will leave for people to read the book. What would you recommend that people do in Zambia?
I think, like I mentioned, it's really a nature lover's paradise, actually, in my opinion. There was, of course, Victoria Falls, which is very impressive and, well deserving of.
Is that what took you to Zambia in the first place? Or were you just going every place? If the road went there, you were going there.
Yeah, that was kind of the route that we had planned generally.
Mm-hmm.
We came up from Zimbabwe, from Harare, and then we crossed into Zambia. I think before we got there, we just kind of wanted to see Zambia, just, I guess, for the sake of seeing it. We did also want to go to Victoria Falls, which we did. We crossed into Zambia and then immediately head down to Victoria Falls before sort of backtracking a little bit and going up through the rest of the country.
And with Victoria Falls, do you have any tips for someone who's going to go there? Go bring an umbrella. What do people need to know before they go to Victoria Falls, especially from the Zambia side?
If you look at like a map of Victoria Falls, I think there's actually more of the falls itself on the Zambian side.
Mm-hmm.
There's more area to view it from the Zimbabwean side, if that makes sense. The border's kind of like squiggly like that.
Kind of like a river.
Kind of like a river. I think you could see more of it from the Zimbabwean side, but the side that we saw from Zambia was spectacular. When we went there, it was, I guess that was probably, I don't know, I want to say like March-ish, March or April, something like that. I can't remember exactly, but the falls were going full blast at the time. And the way that the falls are, is the water goes down and then it goes into a ravine, and then you view it standing on the other side of the ravine, essentially. And when the water was going full blast like it was when we were there, it often made it hard to actually get a full view of the falls because the water would come crashing down with such force that it would blow up the other side of the ravine, and then it would just start raining down on you.
Uh-huh.
So it was essentially like it was a bright and sunny day, but we were just getting rained on constantly. So yes, a poncho is well worth it. An umbrella would be completely useless because the wind's just going to blow the water in from all directions. It's not just going to come straight down on you. It's going to come from everywhere. But anticipate getting wet, that's for sure, if the falls are going at full volume. I've seen pictures and stuff of the falls at the lowest levels that they usually are throughout the year, and it's like a little trickle. But when we were there, they were roaring. They were absolutely roaring. And it was awesome. We loved it.
Well, and we've got a whole episode on Victoria Falls, episode 371, if people are interested in more. So what did you do after that? Where did you go?
From Victoria Falls, we cut northward and we went to Kafue National Park. We'd done some game drives in other parts of Africa, and we had never seen a leopard up to that point, which I was very upset about.
Difficult to see, nocturnal.
Yes, they are. And I started to believe that they were maybe a myth until we had read somewhere that Kafue National Park was really good for spotting leopards. So had to go there. It was fairly close, more or less on the way from where we were going. So we stopped in there.
At the risk of this sentence turning into a joke, you spotted leopards in Kafue National Park?
Yes, we spotted one eventually.
Okay.
There's a slightly funny story of something that happened to us right outside the park. This can also be informative as well as entertaining. You should see the park via the proper roads.
Okay.
We went up from Vic Falls, and then we went to either Kalomo or Choma is the name of the town. I can't remember exactly where. But from there, we basically just cut straight northward, which is geographically the shortest route. And we assumed it would be the best. It was not. It was a terrible route. We took this one road. We actually had a GPS that was leading us the whole way. And the GPS was showing this one road that was basically skirting the edge of the park, going up north. And we had our eye on one particular lodge that we wanted to see. And the further out of town that we drove through one town called Itezi, and then we just drove north from there, and basically just skirted the Kafue River going all the way up. We had our eyes on this one lodge that was just north of there. And the road became less and less existent, I guess you could say. Like it just slowly sort of disappeared. We drove through a village several times, and we drove through a cornfield at one point.
And when you say you drove through a village several times, even with the GPS, it was difficult to navigate.
Yes, it was. The further north we got, the less clear the road became, the less clear the path became. And we drove through villages, cornfields. At one point we drove through. There were still tire tracks. I should make that note. There's still tire tracks there that you could kind of see. So people had obviously driven there before, but we drove through like grass that was taller than our car. So we just had to, like, we couldn't see anything. We just had to mow down this grass with our car. Eventually we got to the point where it was getting dark and we didn't know what to do. We were going to try like one more creek crossing to get close to where this lodge was. And I drove down to where the tire tracks were. I didn't want to actually ford that part of the creek because I just couldn't see it because it was getting too dark. So I pulled off the road and then I turned just to the right to go off the path a little bit. And then immediately our car slammed headfirst into this ditch. The front wheels were just completely spinning in the air. We ended up having to spend the night in this car in like the middle of nowhere. And it was actually on the side of the Kafue River, which is outside of the national park, technically. But as somebody told us later, everything that's in the park is also outside of the park.
Yeah, sure. The animals don't necessarily see the boundaries as impenetrable.
Yeah, no, they're definitely not. So there were lion tracks all the way around our car. We could hear the hippos getting close. I mean, anybody who's been on safari in Africa will tell you hippos are incredibly dangerous.
Sure.
And we could hear them from the inside of our car very close to us. So, there was all kinds of like dangerous wildlife around. But we ended up the next morning hiking to this other lodge that we had passed on the way up, and they got someone to come and tow us out. So I said all that to say this: take the proper roads to get to the park.
So one of the things we learned from this experience, it sounds like, is just because it's a little gray line on the map in Africa, that does not necessarily mean you should drive it.
Yeah, sometimes you have better judgment than a soulless computer. It's worth it to use that judgment from time to time.
And you talked about the leopards. You did manage to see a leopard. The usual set of animals in Kafue National Park, the big five, what are we looking at?
Eventually, when we got to a more proper lodge, we did a few game drives around the area. We only did like 2, maybe. We saw a pride of lions one morning and followed them for a while, which is pretty cool. There are lots of herbivorous animals around. We saw plenty of zebras and impalas and kudu and other things like that. And then the leopard, we saw that kind of on our own drive in the morning. We were driving out from this lodge. We were kind of disappointed because we'd been there for a couple of days and we hadn't seen much. Certainly hadn't seen the leopard. So we decided to wake up at 5 a.m. one morning and go do our own little game drive around the area. Almost as soon as we pulled out of the campsite that we were at, I saw this leopard right on the road just sort of materialize in front of us. And we just started like freaking out, like, oh, there it is, finally, yeah. We were very excited about it. And we kind of tracked it for a little while until he just kind of dashed off into the woods. When we went back in the morning to collect our things before leaving, we told somebody who worked at the lodge about the leopard just outside the camp. And he said, "Ah, Tinkerbell, Tinkerbell." He kept on saying that over and over again. I had no idea what he was saying. I thought he was just making some kind of general exclamation
That's
in the local
name
tongue.
of the leopard?
Yes, it was the name of the Tinkerbell.
Tinkerbell.
The little fairy from Peter Pan. It took us several minutes to actually figure out that he was saying the name of the leopard, which was Tinkerbell. Apparently that leopard comes in all the time and drinks from the pool and hunts the monkeys and everything. So they see her a lot.
Anything else we want to say about Kafue before we move on?
So as for getting around the entire country in general, your best bet, particularly if you want to do some game drives in some of the parks, is to hire a 4x4 car. There are a couple of companies that do it where you can, like, there's one in particular in Livingston in Zambia at Victoria Falls where you can rent pickup trucks, like Toyota pickup trucks that are 4-wheel drive, and they outfit them with pop-up tents and, little kitchenettes and storage areas and things like that. That's probably the best way to really see the country on your own, especially if you think you're going to be doing any sort of off-roading. The country has, at the airports and in the big cities and stuff, you can rent cars from Budget Car Rental and those sorts of companies. They're not going to be 4-wheel drive, obviously, but you can rent them, and that would be cheaper than a 4-wheel drive place. But I would recommend getting a 4-wheel drive vehicle and going off-road.
Although possibly not quite as off-road as you did.
Not quite as off-road. It would be nice to keep all 4 tires on the ground. And don't drive at night either.
Yeah, I don't know if we've talked about that, because we haven't talked about a lot of driving trips in Africa, but there's a lot of activity at night in some of those areas that poses some additional dangers.
Yes, absolutely. Lots of nocturnal animals. Leopards are, I think, almost exclusively nocturnal. Not exclusively. They're active during the day too, but they're mostly nocturnal. Lions are often nocturnal as well.
Right.
Even the diurnal animals, the animals that hunt during the daytime, they usually will prefer to hunt early in the morning, like right before the sun rises, or late at night when it's getting dark. We always had a rule when we were driving to try and avoid driving at night as much as possible, and we made very few exceptions to that rule, and for good reason. It wasn't even just driving in the game parks. We just generally didn't want to drive in Africa at night anyway.
Right, sure. Where would we go next? Where would you recommend?
From Kafue National Park, I would probably head from Kafue through Lusaka. The main road leads through Lusaka, the capital. There's not a ton to do there, really. It's just kind of a city. Well, I will say this. There's one very delicious restaurant in Lusaka called Marlin Steakhouse. It was recommended to us by a guy that we met who lives there, or he used to live there. He was actually an American who was working there for a while, but he recommended it to us, and it was outstanding. It was really, really delicious steak. I cut it with a butter knife just to see if I could. Outside of that, there's not that much to see or do in Lusaka unless you want to go to the malls and stock up on some goods. From Kafue to Lusaka to Lower Zambezi National Park. It's a relatively new park. When we were there, we actually stayed a little bit on the outside of the park. We stayed at a lodge that was at the confluence of the Kafue and Zambezi rivers. We went there because I really wanted to go tiger fishing. So if you don't know what the tiger fish is, it is an absolute monstrous fish. And it's very highly sought after as far as fishermen are concerned. They really love to go and fight these because they put up a really, really strong fight. If you look at them too, they have really menacing, vicious looking teeth. Very imposing fish. And they live in the Zambezi River. And so we went to this one little lodge at the confluence of these two rivers to do some fishing and try to catch a tiger. It was the wrong time of year. It was sort of the winter time. They tend to stay like towards the bottom of the river. They don't feed very much. So we took a boat out on the river for like a half a day and fished with a special rig to catch them. And I think I got a hit at one point, but he didn't even take the bait. So it was kind of a bust for me. But if you enjoy fishing at all, from what I understand, it is well worth it to seek out the tiger fish. And it was cool to take a boat too, because there were lots of hippos and stuff floating around in the river.
And I'll have to say, looking at a picture of a tigerfish, it looks like somebody photoshopped it.
Yeah, I know. That's what they look like.
It looks like somebody took maybe a little tiny piranha and blew it up in Photoshop. I mean, I don't think I want to pull one of those into my boat.
The species that lives in the Zambezi River it usually doesn't get much more than maybe 4 feet long, 3 feet long, something like that. I think there's another species that lives in another river system in the Congo, maybe, that gets huge, 10, 12 feet, something like that. And it looks more or less the same. It's just gigantic.
It's a 4-foot fish with teeth that are, 2 inches long, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mouthful of daggers, no question. Really, it's like a nightmare fish. They put up a great fight, and they taste really good, too, as I've been told.
Well, and when you went to Lower Zambezi, then we went basically east from the capital, and now you're on the border with both Zimbabwe and Mozambique.
Well, the park itself does go that way,
Oh,
but we were just outside of it, confluence of the Fue River and the Zambezi River. I'm guessing you're looking at a map right
I
now.
am indeed looking at a map.
Yeah, okay. So there's a little town called Chiawa
Okay.
right there on the river. If you go back westwards just a little bit, that's where the confluence is.
Got it. Where to next?
After Lower Zambezi National, well, I should say that Lower Zambezi itself is probably worth a visit as well. It's, being a protected area, there's a lot of wildlife there, elephants, hippos, giraffes, zebras, that kind of thing. So if you didn't see those kinds of things in Kafue National Park, maybe go to Lower Zambezi National Park proper and see if you can see them there. I think you can still fish in the river there too, I believe. But after Lower Zambezi, I would venture up to South Luangwa National Park. That's going up a little bit further towards Malawi. South Luangwa Park, in my opinion, is possibly the most underrated game reserve in Africa. I mean, you can see where it is on the map.
Yeah.
There's not much else going on there. I mean, there are a few other national parks around there, but there's not much else that's going to draw tourists in internationally. If you're going to that area, you're going to South Luangwa.
Right. You're not going to accidentally go past there on the way someplace else.
Yeah. It was a really spectacular park. Like the wildlife there was very, very impressive. We saw all of the big five in a couple of hours on one game drive.
And we mentioned the big five, and I'm assuming when I said that people knew what the big five were, but we probably should list the big five because it's not what people would think.
That's true. The term is actually a holdover from British hunters. They're not actually the physically biggest five animals on the continent. They're actually the five that were sort of the key hunting trophies,
right,
from these Victorian hunters. It's the elephant, the leopard, the rhino, the lion, and the buffalo, Cape buffalo.
And I think that's the one that always surprises people that it's in that.
Yeah, the buffalo. They are ferocious. I think the idea is like those five animals are the ones that will put up the biggest fight if you corner them before you shoot them in the face or whatever it is. But today, they're kind of the big five that are sought after by non-lethal explorers.
Well, and the most rare of those would be the rhinos, which are more critically endangered than the other animals.
Yes, but we did see rhinos in that park. They certainly have them. I'm pretty sure we actually saw them on that game drive. I may have misspoken before, but I'm pretty sure we actually did. But it's just like the density of wildlife once you cross into the park is just astounding. Zambia has this law, this tax that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me, but they charge you per bed per night if you stay inside of a national park. It's an extra, I think they call it the bed levy or something. It's an extra tax that they add on to generate revenue, I guess.
Actually, most cities in the U.S. have something like that is funding their local stadium or something like that. I don't know about most, but many, many cities. So not very uncommon.
But as a result of that law, a lot of the lodges in Zambia, all around Zambia, have built like just outside of the legal boundaries, and then they make sort of incursions in.
Sure.
Which is a smart way of doing it. But if you look at a map of South Luangwa National Park, there's a river that runs along the southeastern edge of the park, which marks the border. So we stayed along there, and then we would take game drives in the morning, and even just across the river, the wildlife just explodes. There are relatively open plains. There's not too many trees, so you can see a fair distance. There's just so much there. It was very impressive. We really had a great tour. We were on one of the game drives with a group of people who had been on a game drive earlier that morning, and they had seen a pride of lions eating a hippo that they had just taken down, which I'm sure was a spectacular sight. We went with them on the evening drive, and by that time, the lions had already finished, and there wasn't much of a carcass left, which was unfortunate, but I'm sure that was very cool to see.
Now, I want to put this in perspective. You said that this is one of, if not the most impressive park that you saw in Africa. Mm-hmm. On your 7-month trip when you were spending most of the time seeing wildlife. So do you know how many parks you went to roughly?
13.
Okay. And what is probably the best known parks that you went to? Because I know you were all the way up into Kenya. So,
We did Serengeti National Park.
okay. That I think people have heard of. Yep. You liked this one better.
No, I think Serengeti was actually probably better
Okay.
than South Luangwa. But Serengeti was probably my favorite from the entire trip. But South Luangwa was pretty close. We did Serengeti and South Luangwa, and I think the other famous one that people may have heard of is Kruger National Park in South Africa. That has a very long history of being protected, and it has a ton of wildlife as well. I mean, they're all different parks. They all have a different feel to them. They all have different landscapes and everything. You know, somewhat similar animals, just maybe in different densities or different spread out in different areas or whatnot. But those three parks.
Well, cool. Well, that's good company. Even the top three there, that's pretty good company. When you talk about your whole trip and we focus in on Zambia, how does Zambia differ for you? How does it stand out as a country from some of the other places that you saw? What makes it Zambia?
Before we got there, I kind of had this opinion of Zambia as I had this term that I made up called a spare country. If you look at it on a map, it doesn't really look like any historic boundaries of any.
It's an odd shape.
It's a very odd shape, especially with that weird piece of the DRC that like juts down in the middle of it. It looks like a country that was formed when all of the other countries around it were carved up. And like it was kind of left over. It was like spare land that they just made into a country, which is where I got that term from. But they really have a very strong national sense of pride that I was very impressed with. Having just come from Zimbabwe with its crazy despotic leader, coming into Zambia and experiencing their political stability was surprising to me, to say the least. At the time, they had their vice president was a white guy, which was almost unheard of. I mean, he was the most powerful white politician in Africa by far, and he was fairly elected. Like he was popular, freely elected. He earned it, and people didn't care that he was white, and they voted him in. It was very impressive to see that, because like in Zimbabwe or South Africa, that would be absolutely unheard of. Like that's just complete non-starter. But I read a quote by him. Hold on, I need to look up his name. It's Guy something.
Guy Scott?
Guy Scott. There you go. Is he still in office?
No. 2014.
Okay. That aspect alone of Zambia was quite impressive to me. Guy Scott had a quote at one point where he said, I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines of Zambia going from a post-colonial to a cosmopolitan mindset.
How about this one? I have long suspected Zambia is moving from a post-colonial to a cosmopolitan condition. People's minds are changing. They are no longer sitting back and dwelling on what was wrong about colonialism.
There you go. That's the quote. I found that to be quite true. We had another friend that we met there, an American. I think I mentioned him briefly just now. I met him. His name is Todd. I met him when we were at that fishing place near Lower Zambezi. He was working in a city up in the north called Kitwe. He was overseeing the construction of a mall there. And I mean, he was kind of a character in his own right. He was actually in contention. He was on Zambian Idol, and he was doing quite well for himself.
Okay.
According to him, several people had him favored to win it. I don't think he actually did in the end, but he was a finalist in Zambian Idol. Like all he did was just get up on stage and start belting out a few Zambian songs on his acoustic guitar, and the crowd just loved it. They just ate it up, which I thought was quite interesting. He was even on TV at one point playing gospel music or something. I don't remember what the context was exactly, but he was on TV playing gospel music on his guitar. So he was kind of like a mini celebrity. But we stayed with him for a few days in Kitwe, and we spent a lot of time at this one particular bar we went back to a few times, which was just great. I mean, the people there were absolutely outstanding, extremely nice to us, extremely jovial, kind, funny, all that. We had a great time staying with them, just going to this bar, and we went to a few other places around town. They took us to this market in Kitwe that was not a black market, but this back alley market. It was really big, and they sold all kinds of pirated car parts and fabrics and meats and all kinds. I mean, a little bit of everything. It was just so much fun to see sort of a different side of Zambia that most tourists don't get to see. The personal lives of people in a place like that was very interesting to us.
One of the things I found with Africa is I went for the animals. I would think of sub-Saharan Africa and Tanzania in particular for me. And I tell people I went for the animals and I would go back for the people.
Yeah, that's a good way to think of it for sure. We found that some of the countries that we went to on that trip, I won't specify which ones, but some of the countries that we went to on that trip, people were not terribly kind to us. They were not terribly great people all the way around. I mean, there were exceptions in all of those places, but there were countries that we just did not really want to go back to. Zambia is not one of those countries. Zambia it really stood out to us. Zambia and Zimbabwe actually really stood out to us as countries that were very impressive in terms of the kindness and generosity.
Interesting, because those two countries are heading in very different directions politically.
Yes, they are politically, but Zimbabwe, we were just blown out of the water by how kind people were in Zimbabwe, especially since most of what we knew was Robert Mugabe, which is...
You're not wearing his fan club t-shirt.
No, I am not. A lot of the citizens are, but we were really, really impressed with Zimbabwe. There were several stories I could tell to highlight that kindness, but this is not about Zimbabwe, so I'll leave it.
Okay. Other places you would recommend we see before we wrap up the itinerary portion of Zambia? I have got a couple questions I want to ask after that.
That's probably what I would put on an itinerary for a week. Those kind of 4 locations: Vic Falls, Kafue, Lower Zambezi, and South Luangwa. I think there's a few other national parks that you could visit in the area, especially up by South Luangwa. There are a few more that are nearby. If you had the time, you could do that.
If you expanded it to 2 weeks, would you include another country or would you include more of Zambia?
I would probably include another country.
Okay.
If we expanded it to 2 weeks, I'll tell you what I would do. I would probably go down to Botswana.
Okay.
So down by...
In the Delta?
Yes, the Okavango Delta, Chobe National Park in the Okavango Delta. I actually found out something interesting later on after we left Africa about that area. There are 5 countries there: Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, Namibia, and Botswana.
Right. I don't know how Namibia got there. This little finger of land coming in there. Yep.
Yeah, a little spit of land. I had that same question. It turns out that colonial powers wanted land on the Zambezi River because they wanted a port that goes out to sea. So they got that strip, and then they realized that, that's actually a giant waterfall just down the way. Whoops. And they kept it in there. So it was kind of silly of them. But anyway, I found out later something that I think is of great interest to me personally is that those 5 countries have teamed up, and those 5 countries are trying to make one gigantic super park. And if you look at the map, it is a very sparsely populated area, and there are a lot of interconnected game parks and national parks in that area. And so they're just trying to make it essentially one large interconnected protected area for animals. Like there are elephants that will migrate freely from the Okavango Delta up through Namibia and into Angola and over to Zambia and back down into Zimbabwe. Like migratory animals roam quite freely amongst all those borders. So I think that would be a really cool project if it actually comes to fruition.
Well, and you see some of that further north between Kenya and Tanzania, where the animals are migrating back and forth between the various parks in those 2 countries, and probably even further that I'm not aware of. But
it's very interesting to see. But getting back to your original question, if I could expand it to 2 weeks, I would go to Botswana. When we were there, we did Chobe National Park and Moremi Game Reserve, which is right in the middle of the Okavango Delta. And that's just an incredibly unique area. It's particularly the Okavango Delta. It's just fascinating. First of all, it's fascinating to me that there even is such thing as an inland delta, much less one that is massive. But we took a canoe trip through the waters and saw all kinds of things, and went on some game drives and saw cheetahs and stuff like that. It was an absolutely beautiful area.
And I'm going to recommend people who want to learn more about that. We've done a show on Botswana, and especially on that part of the country with Spencer Kwong back in episode 274. So you can look up more information about the Okavango Delta in northern Botswana.
Mm-hmm.
Talking back about Zambia, then, you've talked about what surprised you with Zambia. What do you wish you had known before you went?
In the sense that things caught us off guard, I wouldn't really say that there was much that we wish we would have known.
Okay.
other than staying on the right roads.
Well, then we get to my next question, which is one warning you would give besides that one. The gray lines are simply guidelines. Yeah.
Tell you what, I'll move on to the next question because there's one thing I wanted to talk about that we did, which was fun in retrospect, but a terrible idea that we would not do again. When we were coming back down from Nairobi, we crossed back through Tanzania, and we were going to stay with our friend Todd, who lived in Kitwe. And if you look at a map,
so you had to drive through the
Zambia,
Congo.
Yes, that little strip of land of the Congo that juts down, the little peninsula of the Congo that juts down in there is called the Pedicle. And there's a road that goes across it, which is quite close to Kitwe. And so we figured instead of driving all the way around the Pedicle and getting to Kitwe that way, we would just take our chances and cross the Pedicle. And that was an absolutely awful idea. It worked. We got there. We were safe, more or less. We were just much poorer in both money and spirit by the time we got across. And just talking with the border guards, I guess you'd call them, for the DRC, going on the way in, it was just an unbelievable headache. Like we had to pay $50 US dollars per person just for a visa, just to cross that little strip of land, which should not have taken long at all. But they still had to charge us for a full visa. And we had to pay.
Yeah, we're talking, 30 miles of road, probably.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It ended up taking us 4 hours because the road is in such unbelievably awful conditions. But it's short and it shouldn't take that long. But on the way in, they had all these people that were speaking French and didn't speak much English. And they kept on taking our information down in these different books. And then we'd go into another room and they would take our information down again, the same information in a different book. And then we have to pay them for the privilege of telling them our information. I guess we never really knew what we were paying for. I'm pretty sure we paid a lot of bribes unintentionally, but we really didn't have the chance. We were kind of captive audience at that point. It was either pay and get through or go way all the way around. So we decided to just go through it. But by the time we got out the other side back into Zambia, we were just so angry at being taken advantage of and being confused and how awful the road was and everything. It was a huge headache. I would not recommend doing that. We did it just kind of for the sake of, number one, to save time, but also just to say that we went to the DRC. Even if it was only 4 hours, we got enough of an experience to qualify it and put it on the list of countries we visited, even if it was all negative and aggravating.
Yeah, I was going to say, you got an experience that it seems like you were successful at. Speaking of experiences, who is the most memorable local you met?
Well, there aren't many that I can remember by name. We met several people in the bar that were very interesting people. We talked with them a few times. There was this one guy that I was sitting with at the bar who was just, we both had our drinks and he just delves, he might have been slightly drunk, but he just sort of delved into his general philosophies on life. And he just expounded all of his philosophies on interpersonal relationships and politics and dating and all marriage, all these kind of things within a very short period of time. He was just, I don't know, maybe he was just getting some things off his chest. Maybe he was just like a hyper extrovert or whatever, but he was very talkative and very, very interesting to listen to. I think I actually learned a lot about just kind of like some general Zambian mindset from that guy and a few other people that we talked to in that area.
The time you felt closest to home, most familiar, most comfortable, and the time you felt furthest from home. I don't know what we're doing here.
I think the time that we felt most comfortable was probably in Lusaka. They have some nice malls, with
it was the steakhouse, wasn't it?
Oh yes, that was the steak. There were lots of nice malls in Zambia, in Lusaka, that have all these big, comfy South African stores that brought all this familiarity.
Sure, could be anywhere.
Yeah, places that we felt we really didn't know what we were doing was probably the time we got stuck in the ditch outside of Efuwe National Park. There's one part of that story that I didn't actually talk about. The next morning, when we were walking from the car to the lodge, there is an animal in that area called the tsetse fly.
Yes.
Which is the worst thing in the entire universe.
Yeah.
I'm not even exaggerating. They are horrible. And we were just walking, and they're apparently attracted to the color blue, which I didn't know, but I was the only one with a blue shirt on. Yes. I can kind of attest to that because I was wearing a blue shirt and they ate me alive. Really big flies, and they will just attach themselves to anything that moves and bite and bite and bite, and they're just everywhere, and I hate them forever. We were actually walking because we had seen the lion tracks around the car the night before. We were walking through this area and we're like, okay, there are lions here. There are probably other predators too. We didn't have anything to really protect ourselves, but I had this steering wheel lock. You know, those kind of bars that you stick across your steering wheel. That's all I had to protect us. So we were just like staying close to each other and walking and keeping an eye out over our shoulders at all time. And I'm walking with this metal bar, so I can, I guess, hit a lion if he tries to attack me. Not going to do much, but I guess it's better than nothing. That was probably the most out of the way, most uncomfortable that we felt.
Well, and of course, they're also associated, the tsetse fly is also associated with sleeping sickness. So that's the first thing I thought of when you said that. Is not a particular insect that I want to spend a lot of time with.
Nope.
One thing that makes you laugh in, say, only in Zambia.
I think maybe my friend Todd being on TV and being on Zambian Idol and doing quite well for himself. That was kind of funny to me. He was a very talkative guy, and he made a lot of friends around Kitwe. Every time we would go out, he would just be glad-handing people, like just random people off the streets that he knew. He would just say, "Hey, how you doing? Thanks for coming out," or whatever it was. I kind of joked with him, like if you ever ran for mayor of Kitwe, he's well ahead of the game in terms of networking with everyone, and he'd probably win.
Well, and that raises the question of English.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much everyone speaks English.
That sort of implied that if you were an English speaker, this would be a pretty easy country to navigate.
Yeah, it would be. You'll hear the locals talking to each other in their local tongues, but most everybody you meet, especially in touristy areas, are going to speak English.
Getting down to our last three questions, you're standing in the prettiest spot you saw in Zambia. Where are you standing, and what are you looking at?
Tough call. That would be Victoria Falls or maybe somewhere in South Luangwa, like sitting in the back of the vehicle, just watching all the game swarm around you. Yeah, either one of those two places.
Finish this thought. You really know you're in Zambia when what?
When you are watching a giant herd of buffalo walk right past some zebras, and there are some impalas in the distance, and there's a lion next to you, and there's just all kinds of life around you.
When the lion is next to you, I'm hoping you're in an enclosed vehicle.
Yes. I mean, they're semi-open.
Sure, yeah.
But you're elevated a little bit, so you're mostly safe.
Right. Well, I don't know about you, but when that lion is right next to you and he or she growls, there's a certain loosening of the bowels. Let's say there's a very, very visceral reaction to that sort of thing at a level that is deeper than thought.
Yep, there's a gut reaction there.
And finally, if you had to summarize Zambia in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Really beautiful nature.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Graham Wales from outboundclan.com. And Graham, why don't you plug your book one more time?
Sure, I would love to. The book is Fortune, Folly, and 1,000 Fates, a disastrously impulsive honeymoon in Africa. Available now on Amazon.
Since you've talked about it as being an appropriate title, this wasn't the only disaster you had during this trip.
Not by a long shot.
So this wasn't even the worst decision you made driving on the little gray line in Zambia.
I think our experience in Zambia was probably one of the most relaxed experiences that we had in any of the countries that we visited. Well, getting stuck in the ditch outside of a national park in Zambia was actually the second time that happened to us. The first time it happened was in Namibia, at a place called Fish River Canyon, where we were stuck in the desert for about 24 hours in the sand in cheetah territory with absolutely nobody around. I won't give away too many spoilers for that. We got out eventually, but it was harrowing and a lot of fun in retrospect, actually.
At least you're a little too large to be game for a cheetah. That's about the only thing I would say about that compared to lion territory. But Graham, thanks so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your obvious love for Zambia.
My pleasure. Glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
In news of the community, I heard from Elizabeth, who said, "Hello, so glad I've discovered your podcast. I listen to it almost every day. My husband has recently retired and I'm working part-time, so we are beginning to write our bucket list. In the last couple of years, we visited Egypt, Italy, and Israel. Awesome trips. We love the world and we love traveling. And next couple of years, we hope to go to Peru, Costa Rica, and Southeast Asia. Last week, we visited Nashville. I took notes from your podcast that made it a very eventful trip. We leave for Richmond Saturday, and I took notes on that one as well. I really like your interview style. Really love most everything about your podcast. It is obvious that you put some time into planning it so that it's worthwhile to listen to. Not a fan of rambling podcasts, usually anyway. Thank you for all the time you put into helping us fellow travelers. Well, I had to admit to Elizabeth that we don't always put that much time into planning the podcast. I don't. The guest usually does. But we put a lot of time into editing the podcast. So we edit out those moments where we have to look up that fact, or where a truck goes by, or we lose the Skype connection. Because you guys don't need to hear that. You've got other things that you can do. I'm a little concerned, Elizabeth, that you're listening every day. You're going to run out. I can't make them daily, not with the effort that it takes. But I'm glad you're enjoying it. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. For all the latest announcements in terms of what's going on at Amateur Traveler, join the email list. And thanks so much for listening.